Yeah.
Welcome to Tony at 12. I'm Tony LeBlanc, and today I'm in conversation with Bob Cartwright, Treasurer of the Michael Sedgwick Memorial Trust. And we're going to talk about a famous motoring journalist and his legacy. Very good to see you, Bob. Thanks very much for sparing me some time.
Good to see you, Tony. Thank you.
Um, First of all, who was Michael Sedgwick?
Well, Michael, as you know, you'll know if you look at his Wikipedia write-up, was classically educated at Winchester and went to Corpus Christi in Oxford, and then, like so many people with a love of history, became a teacher.
Right.
Uh, Now, as a sideline, as a hobby, he used to write, as 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 indeed I do, articles for magazines and write letters and so on to the motoring press of the day. But of course, in the time that we're talking about, the early 50s, there wasn't very much about old motoring. It was all about current motoring.
Mm,
Having said that, with the in post-war times, people were mostly using pre-war cars because there were restrictions on selling new post-war cars. It was export or die was the
yeah.
phrase. So all of the cars being made in the UK were going abroad. So he was sort of writing, and it was a hobby basically for him until the late 1950s when he got involved with Veteran and Vintage magazine, which was run by Lord Montagu, in effect. Now, the 50s had seen a surge in the interest in early motoring, not least through the thing that it was 70 years old last year, the film Genevieve,
Mm,
which many people will remember involved veteran cars, a Spiker and a Panhard, I think it was. And that really ignited the public's interest in really old cars, going back to the veteran era. And so Veteran and Vintage magazine was introduced by Lord Montagu. And indeed, he began the Montagu Motor Museum as it was by displaying some of these older cars, which of course are quite small and therefore can fit through doorways that perhaps modern cars might not. And he started off by displaying them in the lobby, at the foot of the stairs in his house.
okay.
Um, Now, Michael really started to get involved when the a person who was originally going to create the first catalogue for Lord Montagu's museum let him down. And Michael sat down and in 3 days of pretty much non-stop working, produced the whole catalogue, which perhaps these days doesn't seem such a difficult thing, but in those days there was no internet, and therefore he was grabbing facts from wherever he could, the books and people. So it was really quite an achievement. And that really cemented his relationship with Lord Montagu. From then, he became the first curator of the Montagu Motor Museum, which of course became the National Motor Museum. And in fact, at that point, he was living in a flat in the top of Palace House. So he was very much living on the job, as it so.
It's interesting to know this because quite often when we fly over to Southampton from Alderney, we go over the museum. So
Yes.
yeah. So what's it? Is it called the National Motor Museum now?
Yes, it's called the National Motor Museum now. I mean, there are two really compete for the title. There's the British Motor Museum, which is up at Gaydon, used to be the
Yeah.
Jaguar Daimler Heritage, and really has a great deal of British Leyland and Jaguar related artifacts, but is also quite a good museum in itself. The National Motor Museum is as you say, in Bewley, and now has, of course, its own purpose-built, not only the collection of cars, but ephemera, and a very substantial library, probably the most complete library in there. And that is one of the things that we are very fortunate in, because and we'll come on to this, if we want to know if a book has been written, or a subject for a book has been written about before, we have the ideal place to go and look, because it is pretty comprehensive. So it's a good thing. But it's for researchers in modern day, you can only go so far with the internet if you're trying to go back to original source, which obviously all historians should be doing. And therefore it's a very important storage of information. Lots of good stuff.
Now,
so
yeah, I was going to go on to say that Michael Sedgwick, 1966, starts writing his own series of books. And getting the quote off Wikipedia, he's famous for his tenacious research and his ability to see any era of the motor vehicle in a social or commercial perspective, which was widely acknowledged. That's quite something, isn't it, for somebody to have that breadth of knowledge?
It is. It is. I mean, his favourite, just to put it out there, was a Fiat, the giant Italian manufacturer, albeit in the early period, not the modern period. But I mean, one of the books that I've got, which I'll just say there, which is Michael Sedgwick's Cars of the 50s and 60s. I've also got 30s and 40s there. They are very good at not only talking about the technical aspects, but the social aspects and how they were promoted, the advertising. It's not just a dry catalogue of they did this and that. It does put it very much into context. I mean, I never met Michael Sedgwick. I'm a slightly later era, although many people I know do have. I mean, my first encounter with him was my A to Z of Cars of the 45 to 70, which is a very good book, and contains some very pithy comments that Michael put in there. Good sense of humour, and he wasn't afraid to say what he thought, much to some people's dismay when he was not complimentary about their favourite vehicle.
Bit like a food critic.
Indeed, yes, but no restaurants for him to get banned from, just clubs.
No,
perhaps they didn't like him quite so much as others. That was another thing that he used to do back in the day, was he used to organise Lord Montague. This is Lord Edward Montague. He used to go and talk to various clubs, motoring clubs and so on. And Michael Sedgwick would go along before, and he referred to it as his John the Baptist. He would go in front of his Lord and organise these things. Which is just another example of his quirky sense of humour. I know at his funeral, Michael Ware was telling me that he once was told by Michael Sedgwick that in all the numerous handwritten letters he wrote, there was always a little reference at the top. And Michael Ware once asked him, what does this mean? He wouldn't actually explain what all of these references mean, but he did let slip that if it said PST in the reference, that meant they were a pest.
Oh, really?
Therefore, yeah, an inveterate and unfortunately persistent letter writer. So
you didn't have to go to Bletchley to get that code broken.
No, not that one. But there were many others that we were never cracked. But he was, so say, a very quirky individual. But,
do we know what he died of? Was it,
I believe it was heart failure.
Yeah.
I'm not absolutely sure.
Because he was only 57, wasn't he?
He was, yes. It was quite a surprise, I think, for all of his colleagues. I mean, he'd as we mentioned, stepped down from being curator of the National Motor Museum, but he did do quite a lot of research, particularly for Lord Montagu's books, although obviously he was researching his own books as well. Lord Montagu would often write the books, but there would be an acknowledgement there in his son. I think I've got his History of Jaguar here, and there's an acknowledgement to Michael Sedgwick that he did, quite a bit of the groundwork for that and many other books. So he, as I say, ceased to be curator. Michael Ware, who I mentioned before, became the curator and succeeded him. And as I say, he became this freelance book writer. I mean, indeed, some of his writings were in German. I know of some books that are quite well regarded in Germany, where he wrote them in the original German, so not just translated. So it's quite a bit of a polymath, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah.
Back basically to being an academic after he left Oxford.
Yes. Yes, I think it very
that
much suited his lifestyle.
Now, within a year or so of his death, the trust was set up. Who was behind that?
Well, it was primarily the two lords. There was a Lord Montagu, obviously, Lord Edward Montagu, who's the owner of the Bewley, who was the owner of the Bewley Estates at that time, and whose museum it was, and also Lord Strathcarron, who was a publisher and very much involved with the assembly of the collections at the National Motor Museum. But a group of his friends got together, and they decided to put together some money and do something in his memory. And they collected, I think in the first year, about £9,000, and over the first 5, 6 years, it grew to about £20,000. And the question was what to do. So they set up a trust, and the trust had as its objects the furtherance of education, in particular in the field of motoring history. Now, that's quite a wide remit. But the original trustees, and indeed all the subsequent trustees, have felt that the best way of representing that has been to primarily help the publication of books on subjects that would have been dear to Michael's heart, as far as we know, and which perhaps otherwise wouldn't get published, because there's always this question: if you go to a publisher with an idea, they'll work out whether it's going to sell, and unless it's Ferrari, Rolls-Royce, etc., the chances are fairly slim. If you're writing a history of a very small car maker or so on, and given the number of those that survive, you actually got quite a small guaranteed audience, and therefore publishers are likely to turn them down. So it's been, financial and advice to people who want to publish books on motoring history. That's been the way. I mean, we have done conferences, and those conferences actually have been mostly around the subject of how to get your motoring book published. So they are kind of an allied purpose, but it doesn't have to be a book. And we have been approached and have looked at things like websites, and the problem for us as trustees is we always want to be sure that there is something to show for the outlay. And the problem with websites is, one, what the costs of them are totally different. You publish a book, it's out there. It's people can buy it if they wish. It's not it's there forever, as it were. And as a couple of at least one copy will be in the Bewley Library. That's one of our conditions of helping people, is that they will give a book to the Bewley Library so that it is comprehensive, and there is no problem. Now, with a website, you can't really do that, and the problem is that the costs are totally different, because it's rarely is it the setup cost, it's just the running costs.
Yeah.
And the problem is, if you ever stop supporting a website and stop paying the running costs, that information then disappears potentially. And so, in terms of legacy, it's not there. So at the moment, at least, until somebody comes up with an idea as to how you get over that problem, we have confined ourselves to books, and they can be huge books. They can be very large and substantial books like this, or they can be tiny books.
Yeah.
One of the ones we see this year is a mere 50 pages or so. So
We've
books it is. So
yeah, because the thing is, of course,
sorry. So that's really how the Oh, sorry, our internet connection's playing up.
we've got a little bit of a wobble, but we'll get through it. I mean, obviously, with websites, you can't archive them, can you? Really?
No, that is the issue.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the other issues we have is that it's an unfortunate thing, but the point at which, and this particularly applies to self-publishers, which we'll talk about perhaps later, the point at which people need money to get themselves over the hill is before the book's published.
Yeah.
But as trustees,
We seem to have frozen up a little bit. I'm sure it will clear in a moment.
honesty is not a happy being. So we tend to, we say, as soon as we receive a book, we'll give you the money if we promised it. And it goes in that order, which, as I say, doesn't suit everybody, but there we are.
How do you assess the cost then of putting a book? Take that small one you just showed us.
Yeah, well, I mean, looking at this book, we are very fortunate in that we have book publishers and authors on the trust, in the trustees, and therefore they have a pretty good idea of not only how much it's going to cost. I mean, we do ask the people to tell us how much they're going to spend, and therefore why they need a bit of a lift to get it passed, because we can probably tell better than they can how many copies they're going to sell if it's something obscure, because we've got a track record of what is it now, 91 titles we've assisted over since 1984. So we've got a pretty good idea how many they're going to sell, and therefore we can kind of check their maths for reasonableness and see what would be a suitable contribution to help them get that book over the line and get it published and out there to the wider public, which is what we see as our objective. So it depends. Obviously, if you're looking at a very large hardback book, the costs are totally different to something, say, like this, that's quite a small softback book. It's one of those things. As I say, I joined the Sedgwick Trust in 2010, and was I felt very privileged. Because I'm an accountant by training. That's my thing. I'm retired now, but that's kind of I'm a numbers man. And I was in a room of about a dozen people, all of whom were authors, publishers, well-known names to me. Some of them very well known. Graham Robson, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, wrote over 170 books on motoring, everything from Morgans to rally cars. Tremendous output. He's a very interesting chap. I mean, he used to tell me that the way that he worked was he would allocate 3 months to write a book, and he would know where he was going to go for all the information before he started. And then he would sit down 3 months and it would be done. And he really was the master of that sort of craft. One of the few people who really made a living out of publishing motoring, simply because of that discipline and the output, because he knew where to go.
Yeah.
What was always interesting was that there was at least one book that we asked him to write and he didn't, because he knew that he couldn't get hold of the right information. The trust doesn't often spot a gap in the market and say, we need a book on this subject. The one gap that remains is a good history of Hillman. Nobody's ever written a good history of the Hillman mark, and that is the most obvious gap. But Graham said, I don't know where I would go. The records are often various private people's, if they exist, obviously a lot having been lost during the bombing of Coventry during the war. So he wouldn't do that one. He did do us a very good book of the Standard Motor Company, which was pretty much the only one that we requested someone to do. But he was an interesting chap.
Because there's a connection, isn't there, between Standard and Hillman in terms of Sir John Black and one of the Hillman daughters.
That's right. Yes, yeah. I mean there was a lot of I won't call it incest, but they were interrelated because, of course, Rover as well. Wilkes married one of the other Hillman daughters.
Yeah.
He was in charge of Rover at the time. So it was a very interesting period where things, although they were apparently rival companies, there was a lot of shall we say, trading of information, perhaps. Willing or not.
But of course, Hillman's eventually get taken over by the Roots brothers, and that's another story, isn't it? But
it is, yes. It's very different, the sort of pre-Roots Hillmans and the post-Roots Hillmans. The same with Humber, which was one of our early books. Someone wrote a history of Humber up till 1932 when Roots took over, and that was one of the very early projects for the trust. So it's quite good. So we had as I say, sitting around the table when I arrived in 2010, not just Graham Robson. Interestingly for you, those of you who are in the Channel Islands, Nick Giordano, who lived on Guernsey. My apologies. As a Guernsey resident, who was also originally a teacher and became a motoring writer, and is one of the few people whose books are better known by the author's name. If you go to a motoring writer and you say, this mark, this company that makes cars is not in Giordano, they will know that you are talking about the Bewley Encyclopedia of the automobile, which was first issued in 1968. I have on the table here the 2000 issue, which is 2 volumes of maybe, I suppose, about 10 inches between the two of them in thickness. But it is very comprehensive. It is the standard work for people. And Nick was another of the trustees when I arrived, and an interesting chap. I mean, he used to fly over for the meetings into Southampton.
Yeah.
We all used to meet in Lord Montague's pub, the Montague Arms, beforehand, have lunch, and then we would pop round to the museum for the actual meeting of the trustees, which are held about 3 times a year. But I remember once Nick, because obviously he hadn't got a car, he'd got a lift from the airport, and he said, "Oh, I'll come with you round to the meeting." And so we hopped into my Morgan, and unfortunately, if you go from the pub in the centre of Bewley round to the motor museum, you have to go across the top of the river.
Yes.
And spring meeting, and the river was as high as it ever gets. And Nick was laughing for hours afterwards because we'd gone through and the water had come up through the floorboards of the Morgan as we went through. But it dried out, and no harm was
Well,
done.
you got enough wood in that Morgan, hadn't you, to actually make it float?
Indeed, yes, there is enough to keep us going. But yeah, that was good. So I'd say Nick was another long-standing trustee who's unfortunately passed away. When I first got involved, I mean, I went down to meet the trustees, and the chairman was Michael Ware, who, as I mentioned, had taken over from Michael Sedgwick as curator of the National Motor Museum and held that post for many years. He was originally a motorsport photographer, and in fact, he only retired from the trust last year, and it continues to write for various motoring magazine.
Yeah.
But he's still very active. So, as I say, we are a dozen trustees who mostly are involved in writing books. We have Mark Hughes, whose publisher used to be with Haynes, who did all the manuals, but a lot of books as well as that. Now edits for Verdon Row, Evro, they call them, the publishing company. We've got Anders, our vice chairman is Anders Klausarger, another well-known name from the Jaguar Daimler Heritage Trust. The chairman is Ray Hutton, who is a former editor of the Autocar. Stephen Lang is curator of the British Motor Museum up at Gaydon. Patrick Collins is librarian at Bewley. And my apologies to anyone I've missed out. But
they'll be watching. They'll be watching.
They will, yes.
You'll get slightly rebuked, I think.
I will. Peter Card will be on to my case. But there we are. As I say, that we are, apart from myself, they are all very much involved in the book trade. And that is how we decide in terms of which projects to support.
Yeah.
You know, is there something already published? Is this new information? Is it from original research? Does it have any unique selling points? Is it access to a photographic collection that's never been seen before? You know, these are the things that count in a book's favour.
Yeah.
In terms of how we support them. In terms of subjects, you know, anything connecting to automotive history is there. I mean, we have gone. Say we've been with commercial vehicles, motorcycles, all kinds of coach builders, as well as marque histories, motorsports, you know, hill climbs, circuit racing, all kinds of things. I think the most unusual projects that we've been approached with, one was invalid cars. Nothing's come of that so far. Another one was foot pumps. Somebody wrote a book about foot pumps, which got published, but in the end, we weren't able to agree support.
That's asking a lot to write a book about foot pumps.
It is, and there's niche and there's niche of niches. But
Yeah, yeah,
so we are interested in all of these things. Sometimes authors decide that it's too much trouble, or sometimes they think we won't support them, and some people. Interestingly enough, a few years ago, some people said that we were only interested in very early motoring and posh books. And it's something I actually put a lot of statistical analysis into to show that actually we support books from all eras.
yeah,
Um, I think if an era is underrepresented, it's because people aren't writing about it
yeah,
yet.
sure, yeah.
And
Tell,
that's the thing.
yeah, tell me, how do you fund the trust?
Well, the trust, as I say, in the early years, in the first 5, 6 years, it accumulated about 20,000
Yeah,
of cash by various donations coming in. Since then, that money's been invested, and with the Church of England's investment arm,
yeah,
which they run for various charities, and that gives an income, but also capital appreciation. I can't claim credit for that. That was something that was going on before I arrived, but it has proved to be extremely useful.
yeah, yeah,
And so um, we've had a couple of donations. We did a couple of years ago receive a legacy unexpectedly from someone we'd never heard of, and which we've never been able to trace any connection to Michael Sedgwick, but who left us a very generous donation. We have recycled quite a bit of money from some of the books.
yeah,
Some of our authors like to have perhaps a larger upfront payment, and then once they've sold so many books, they will give us back on the success, if you like. So
okay, yeah,
after the first 250, they'll give us back £3 a book or some
yeah,
such.
yeah,
Have found in the past, though, that some authors find that discouraging. So we are also, as I say, in the business of making a smaller outright gift,
yes, up front as it were.
just to get it over that hill of
Yeah.
simply being published.
Now,
Because, as I say,
Mr.
if it's not,
Yeah,
mm,
Mr. Zoom tells me we've only got 5 minutes left. And
all right.
what I wanted to do was just to have a word with you about the future of classic cars when petrol is no longer available. How do you see that?
Well, it's interesting because there are two things here. I mean, cars themselves, obviously, going to electric is not that much of a problem,
No.
because if you go back to 1904, and you go to New York City, the cars on the road then were about a third, a third, a third. One
Yeah.
third petrol, one third steam, one third electric.
Yeah.
So, there's a long history of electric vehicles, and therefore vehicles themselves being electric is not a problem. Now, I know some people have put electric motors and batteries into classic cars.
Yeah.
I think the best analogy that I can bring to that one is that there would be outrage if I was to propose that you did the same to the Flying Scotsman.
Sure.
The whole point of running a living, breathing steam engine is that you want to see how it works. You don't want to see it just stuffed in the York National Motor Railway Museum. You want to see it on the tracks performing as it did in its heyday. And that is the important thing.
But
I think
eventually assuming petrol did run out completely, a lot of these
yeah.
classic cars have got very high values. Is
Mm-hmm.
that value going to
Yeah.
be diminished by virtue of the fact you won't be able to drive it?
I think potentially it will. Yes,
Yeah.
if we get to a position where they're all self-driving cars,
Mm.
and the only way you can drive the car is a couple of times a year, go down to Goodwood and race it
Yeah.
on the track. that will diminish
Yeah.
the value. I think, there will be substitute fuels.
Yeah.
I mean, you can already run a diesel car on the fat from your chip shop. So,
So they
you
say.
know, yeah, doesn't do it a lot of good, but you could modify cars to run on
Yeah, and
plant-based
there's
rather.
hydrogen, I suppose, and stuff like that possibly eventually, but
That's
we'll have to see, I
that's
guess.
right.
Yeah.
But so I think people will want to preserve a certain number. I
Yeah.
won't say all the classic cars are in existence now, but a certain number will still be used and will be modified to use, say, plant-based fuels if we can't get. I mean, yeah, there's always going to be a small amount of fossil fuel you think that
One would
might
think so.
start.
One would hope so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but it may go back to the days of when you used to have to buy it yourself from the chemists or whatever. It's smaller amounts. It won't be just go down to the filling station.
No.
You'll have to have your own reserve tank in your garage, a bit like having a central heating boiler.
We hope that's a long way off. Now,
Good.
we have, I'm afraid, to have to say, run out of time. I've really enjoyed it. It's been really interesting. I think I've actually got one of those books about the 1940s and 50s. I'll have to look that out, but it didn't sort of ring a bell at the time. Can I say thank you very, very much for sparing me some time? Really enjoyed chatting to you, and you
Pleasure.
take care. And many
Thank you very much, Dave.
congratulations on your granddaughter's birth.
Thank you very much.
Cheers for now.
Thank you. Bye, Tony.